Are you trying to find God's will for your life? I'm sure you are. I mean, we're all wanting to know God's will in our lives. It's a constant question that we ask God, but it's particularly important when you're a teen or a young adult. And I remember when I was at that stage, I was preoccupied with wanting to know God's will for my life, for career decisions, for marriage decisions, for the decisions which would influence the rest of my life. And I was under the impression that God's will was a railway track and you were either on it or off of it. And it was really important that when you're a young adult that you know exactly what God's will is, because then you'll end up at the right destination. And if you deviate it in any way, you fall into God's plan B, which is sort of like the garbage bin of a failed life. So that it was so important to get it right as a teenager. So that put a lot of pressure on us when we were young. But I'll tell you what happened to me. That when I was finishing high school, my youth pastor came to me and he knew I was thinking about going to university, and he said, had you ever considered going into the ministry? He saw some gifts that I had. Well, no, I had no interest in ministry at all. I wanted to be a doctor like my brother. And then in my final year of medical school, my psychiatric professor, he saw some potential in me, and he invited me to come and join the psychiatric program to become a psychiatrist. I had no interest in that at all, because by that time I had fallen in love with anesthesia, and I wanted to be an anesthetist in a small town. Now, people said, why would you want to be an anesthetist? It's not a popular specialty. It doesn't have its own TV show. And if you've ever heard me speak on this subject, you'll have heard me explain that the reason I became an anesthetist, I always say, it's because it's the most godly of all medical specialties. And then when people look at me curious, I say, do you remember what was God's first medical act? Well, he put Adam to sleep. So obviously anesthesia is very important to him. Plus, it's the most like being in the ministry. So that's what I told people. But anesthesia was just in my heart. I just loved that specialty. And so then I moved to a small town, which is Grimsby, Ontario, where I live now. And I worked in a small hospital. And in the morning I did anesthesia. In the afternoon I was a GP. That was the mix I wanted. That was what was in my heart. I had a passion for that. But in general practice, in retrospect, I realized God sent to me a very large number of people with mental health problems, emotional problems, relationship problems, all subjects I knew nothing about because I was an anesthetist down deep inside. But it sparked an interest in me. And for reasons that just are divine, I started to take an interest in mental health problems. And that interest grew, and God watered it. It was like a seed he planted, he watered it, and it grew and grew and grew. And so it finally took over my life, and I quit anesthesia, I quit general practice, and I did mental and emotional health for the rest of my career. And then I discovered the principles of inner healing and deliverance and prayer ministry, and eventually God put it in my heart, though I didn't realize it at the time, that I needed to start teaching this to Christians because maybe they needed to know about this. And so then I started teaching in churches. So then I gave up my clinic about 11 years ago, and now Kathy and I travel internationally teaching emotional health and mental health because I discovered that's really what my heart is, and that's the gift that God gave me that I wasn't aware of when I graduated from medical school. But clearly I'm in God's will now, setting people free around the world as we teach them. So I'm in ministry, and I'm still in psychiatry, so I'm in a psychiatric ministry. So the funny thing is, what my youth pastor had spotted in me and my psychiatric professor had spotted in me, which I had completely discounted at the time, is actually what I'm walking in now, which is kind of funny. Now, you're probably saying, and I asked this to myself at one point, was I outside of God's will when I became an anesthetist? Was that a wrong decision? Because here I am not doing anesthesia, I'm in psychiatric ministry. Well, no, I was definitely in God's will. You know why? It was because of that career decision that I moved to this small town and joined a very small struggling church that was only about 90 people at that time. Because God wanted me here because in 1994 there was a massive revival that exploded in our church, and God wanted me here for that because that changed the course of history of our church. It went from 90 people to now 1,400. But it changed the course of our lives. Kathy and I were so touched by what God did here that launched us into the ministry we're now doing now by combining what we learned then with my medical training. So it was clearly God's will to bring us here because of my decision to become an anesthetist, so I'd be in the right spot to launch us into what we're doing now. So the bottom line is, the will of God is a series of small steps and some big steps and a lot of mid-course corrections. It is not a straight line the way we think of a straight line. To him it's a straight line, but to us it's a whole series of straight lines that has a lot of twists and turns that are unexpected. But the key is to trust a loving Father to guide and direct you. The Bible says if you trust him, he will direct your paths. And remember, he loves you. He knows the gifts and anointings and callings that he's placed inside you. He wants you to discover them more than you do. And so stay close to him. Trust him. Pay attention to what he puts in your heart, even if the directions change, because he is leading you in a path that you're unaware of. Now, as you look back, as I do now, I sort of laugh that, at the time it was confusing, but now I see his plan. And so trust him, stay close to him. And let me warn you, don't be paralyzed by indecision, because I remember what that feeling was like, and there were so many Christians, especially of my generation, and we were afraid to make any decision because we were waiting for God to hit us on the head with lightning, with a loud voice telling us how to make a decision. You decide based on what he's placed in your heart. If you're walking with him, he will put his desires in your heart. So trust him and relax. Just walk with him and you'll stay in God's will. But be prepared for lots of twists and turns. And if this is your first visit here, you need to get my weekly video that we send out by email. And to do that, just subscribe by filling out the subscription form, which you can access on this page. And I'll talk to you again next week. But this week, ask God to put into your heart what his will is for you and then act on it.